Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today on SuperNova Commencements for what's going to be a great chat. We're streaming live today on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, so you can find us really anywhere. Before we get started today, I just want to acknowledge what's really going on in our country right now. We're going through a tough time, and though many people continue to go through tough times that don't always make the headlines. But it's really heartbreaking to watch what's going on in the country right now. And I hope that we'll be able to find a time where we can live in harmony together, where we can love each other. I'm from Atlanta. And especially because of our guest today, I've grown up thinking about civil rights and what it really means to live civilly and love your fellow human. And it's not just a concept, it's something that we need to really live every day. And we need to stand with everyone that's struggling right now, especially because of the color of their skin. And we just need to live in love. So that's all I want to say. I really want to get to our guest today, who can speak much more eloquently about what's going on and give you advice for the world we live in today. So I want to welcome our guest today, Ambassador Andrew Young. There he is. Hi.
Fine. How you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for joining us.
Well, my pleasure, and congratulations to all of your graduates or whatever you're coming to an end to.
Yeah,
or
the beginnings, right?
What's that?
Or the beginnings.
Yeah, that's what commencement is. The commencement is the beginning of your new life.
That's right.
And I was scared to death at my commencement.
Why?
Because I felt that I was getting a degree and I didn't know what I was supposed to know for that degree. And I didn't know what I was going to do with that degree. And I felt the most lost I've ever been in my life was the last half of my senior year in college. But it's amazing the way all of the problems that I had in college basically became the agenda that I've been dealing with for, and believe it or not, I will have been out of college this June for 69 years.
Wow. I feel like it's been a long time for me. Who was your commencement speaker?
I don't remember.
Yeah. That's the way.
I didn't even want my parents to come to my commencement.
Why not?
I just felt I didn't have anything to celebrate. I was confused, and I was pretty young, but actually on the way back from Howard University, we stopped. This was in 1951, and in those days, no places between Washington and New Orleans hardly were integrated. And so we stopped at a church conference in Kings Mountain, North Carolina. And it was at that conference that we were spending the night, but I wasn't interested in what was going on in the conference. So I went running to the top of a mountain. And on that, I was running too fast and I got too tired, and I had been on Howard's track team and swimming team. So I was in very, very good condition, but I ran so fast that I couldn't breathe when I got to the top. And when I finally came to and opened my eyes and looked at the rest of the world and looked at the whole world as far as I could see on a beautiful, clear day, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Everything out there has a purpose. Mm-hmm. And whoever made the trees and the cornfields and the sunflower fields and the clouds and the stars. Everything has a purpose, and everything else can't have a purpose and I not have one. So I decided that whoever was the creator of all of this heaven and earth uh, could not have created me without having a purpose for my life. And so having decided that there was a purpose that there had to be a purpose for my life, and I didn't need to know what it would be. I would take it one day at a time. And that's the way I've lived my life since 1951. And sure enough, when it's time for me to take another step, it's right there before me. And I ended up going to drive to a conference to help my minister drive. And I got interested in what was going on in the conference out in Texas, Brownwood, Texas. And I came back and they asked me would I be a volunteer for 6 months with this conference. And I said, sure, what the hell, I got nothing else to do. And I did that, and they sent me to Connecticut. Nobody knew what to do with me when I got to Connecticut, so they called the theological seminary and asked if they had an extra room. They did, gave me the extra room, and I said, well, while I'm here, maybe I could walk in, I could sit in on some classes. And I don't know enough about the Bible, and I need to think about life in the future. And so I walked in the dean's office, and he said, well, if you can sit in on 3 classes, we can give you a scholarship. So I ended up sitting in on 3 classes, and I ended up liking what I was learning. And it was really the best time I'd ever had in school, because we were talking about the meaning of life. We were talking about the history of the Bible. And we were talking about the real issues that determine the destiny of the earth on which we live. I got a call saying that they needed someone to run a recreation program in Alabama. I was thinking about going to New York. And the guy who called me said, well, if you don't go to New York, everybody wants to go to New York. And they'll fill your place in a minute. But I can't find anybody else to go to Marion, Alabama. And if you don't go to Alabama, this recreation program for all of these young people will not take place.
Right.
And so that was something that I could do that nobody else could do. So I was sort of trapped by my own logic, and I ended up in Alabama, and lo and behold, that's where I met my wife.
That's right.
It's just been like that for the last 69 years, that I haven't planned one day ahead of the next day, but all of a sudden I meet this girl who's got a Bible, and she's got a senior life-saving certificate, so she was a good swimmer. I was on the swimming team, and she had a basketball letter, and she looked a little bit like you look. So, but I hadn't even seen her, and I had seen her mother and father, and I had studied genetics, but I decided I was going to marry her before I met her.
Wow.
And because I figured that's the only reason. And so that little town was Marion, Alabama. Who else was born in Marion, Alabama besides the young lady I married, Coretta Scott King, who was Martin Luther King's wife?
Right.
And Juanita Abernathy, who was Ralph Abernathy's wife. So all 3 of our wives knew each other, but we
Wow.
didn't know you. But we didn't know each other. And they
You met
all
each
came
other
from the
though
same,
at
they
some
all
point.
came from the same high school. That
Yeah.
looks like God had a plan and used three wonderful women to make three sorry rascals pretty important and powerful men ultimately. So, that's the way life works.
So you're really talking about you didn't necessarily create a plan for yourself.
No, I still don't have a plan. I'm wondering what I do when I grow up.
Well, if you don't know, we certainly are in trouble.
Well, I think
But
you're not supposed to know. I think
right.
I think you take it one day at a time.
And you are open to the path that is laid out in front of you, the doors that are opening. How do you know when to say yes or which way, if the path is leading you in several different ways, which path to take? How did you just make that distinction?
Well, the thing was, if there was nobody else to do it,
Mm.
I ended up going to see Harry Belafonte, who was a friend of Martin Luther King's after Dr. King died. And I was trying to get him to help us raise some money to do voter registration to one day get somebody to run for Congress. And he didn't say a word to me. He turned around and called his wife and said, let's see if we can get a few of our friends together. And his friends were Lena Horne and Sidney Poitier and Tony Bennett. And they said, we can put on a benefit concert. And when his wife said, what for? He said, Andy's running for Congress. I said, no, wait a minute, come on. Not me. I will help somebody else run. He said, no, nobody else to run. Sure, you got to run. And that's how I got to Congress. And then when I got to Congress, I enjoyed it. I was ready to stay there the rest of my life. And Jimmy Carter decides he's going to run for president. And then he calls me and says he needs me to go to the United Nations. And I said, no, there are a lot of better people. He said, no, there's nobody else. I said, why? Barbara Jordan is certainly more. She's a constitutional lawyer. She's a brilliant orator. She'll be a powerful voice at the UN. He said, no question about it. She's better than you in every way but one. I said, what is that? And he said, you happened to march with Martin Luther King. And it was Martin Luther King's message that will give America's foreign policy some credibility. So I end up going to the United Nations. I mean, and I come back from the United Nations and hit Atlanta just at the time that half the city wants to go back and half the city wants to go forward. And there was nobody to kind of bring the two sides together. So your father, amongst other people, said, why don't you need to run for mayor? Well, it wasn't a good job. And anybody who is a mayor right now is catching hell. And I was catching hell in 1981 because the economy was bad. Police were worse than they are now. And that became my job to try to straighten it out. So we immediately moved in and we started police and community relations. And we made sure that the police force was half and half black and white and at least 1/3 female. And it's amazing how 1/3 female policemen, we have a female police chief here in Atlanta now. And there's a lot of difference between the way women will move a crowd versus the way men will try to move a crowd. Men will try to move the crowd by force. Women will move it by reason. And it's just differences. And so a well-balanced police force and you get better law enforcement. Now, it's never going to be perfect. But that's just, that's the way my life is run. except that as I was leaving the mayor's office, some crazy guy by the name of Billy Payne says, "Why don't we bring the Olympics to Atlanta?" Well, that was impossible because everybody thought the Olympics was going to Athens, and uh, Montreal was still $700 million in debt. So it didn't look like a good thing to try to go after the Olympics. But we decided that we could do it. And so the city volunteered to do it with no government money and just raising private money from people who were interested and who loved sports. And I said we had a whole bunch of ex-jocks in a midlife crisis. And we wanted to have one more fling, at the gold medal. And so we brought the whole Olympics to Atlanta, and it turned the whole city into a truly international city. And it's all of the problems I've had and all of the problems you will have become opportunities if you address it in terms of what would I love to see happen as a result of this conflict. And usually you can make it happen because once you've had a clear idea, you'll find that you're not the only one with that idea, that there are lots of other people who share that idea with you. And if you're not interested in just getting rich, now when money gets involved, you get a lot of complications. Now that doesn't mean money's bad. It just means that it's more difficult if you're trying to make money and start a business than it is if you're trying to do something nonprofit as a volunteer. And you have to have some way of earning your living. But your ideals and your dreams can't be just the way to make a living. I guess I'm right about that, but maybe not.
I think you are. So one of the things that you've said, and I've really held on to as I've tried to forge my way through this world, is that it's not about ego. If you want to get something done and truly want to make a difference, you have to abandon ego and just focus on what you're really trying to accomplish. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you have lived in that way and how it's helped you? And how do students also embody that, and how would that help them?
Well, let me just go back to the fact that your father and I have been good friends for many years. And it's amazing the way he came to Alabama in the 60s from India with only $12 in his pocket and helped to build up one of the largest engineering firms in the South. And we worked together to make that a global engineering firm. So you can never tell. And there's really nothing impossible. And there's a phrase, I don't know where it comes from, but if you can conceive it and believe it, you can achieve it. But it takes the idea and the faith in your ability to develop that idea and the determination and energy to keep working on those ideas. And whatever they are, you can make them happen in your life.
So Jeff wants to know, we're going to take a few questions and sprinkle them in. Going back to purpose, what is your advice for young people who are trying to find their purpose? It seems like you've stepped into it and you have found it along the way. How would you tell them to go about finding their purpose?
Well, I think that the Bible says in the New Testament, the kingdom of God is within you. And when I think of purpose, it's not what I want and what I dream of in my head. I mean, I always wanted to go to the Olympics. Um, you know, I didn't make it. I wasn't big enough. I wasn't fast enough. Wasn't strong enough. But I could bring the Olympics to Atlanta.
That's right.
50 years later. Uh, and so your dreams and your ideas are all very valid. And if they come from within you, now I had a real problem because my father was determined that I would take over his business.
Right.
And he was a dentist. And I admired him. We got along. We agreed on everything. I worshiped him, but I didn't want to be a dentist. And so you're going to have to fight your way through what other people think of you and what comes from within. So your purpose, I think, is in you. And in the Bible, it talks about a still small voice. You also get that concept of an inner light in Buddhism and Hinduism. So one of the universal things about religion is that there is a spiritual aspect to life. In fact, Deepak Chopra says that we think of ourselves as physical beings that have occasional spiritual experiences. The truth of it is, we are really spiritual beings, and this is an occasional physical experience. And so, if you think of yourself as a spiritual reality, that you are in touch with the creator of heaven and earth, that the spirit of the creator is within you. And many people use meditation as a means of finding out how to tune themselves into the spirit within them. With me, it always came through action and through people. And but however you, but my one caution for me was that I couldn't be doing what everybody else wanted to do. I didn't have to compete. That there was something that I could do that nobody else could do.
Right.
And that was, I think, the way I learned to center my ambition on and put my ambition in line with the purpose in life and whatever I might have been created for.
So it's really a matter of listening to what's going on in your head, inside, what feels right according to your moral compass, and to have the strength. I'm not sure how you develop that, but I think that's practice, how you develop the strength to listen to what seems right to you versus what you're hearing.
Well, it doesn't take long to know if you're wrong. The world will remind you very quickly.
Right. That's true. Okay, so we're going to take some questions from students. Jordana and Nima basically have a similar question. What do you consider to be the most crucial decision you made to get to where you are today? What's the one decision that had the most impact on your life?
That first trip to Marion, Alabama, where I met a little country girl that I decided would be my wife. And I decided without even meeting her, but I saw a Bible that she was reading, and a senior life-saving certificate on the wall. And I'd been on the swimming team and a basketball letter.
Right.
And I said, this is the kind of girl I need to marry. Now, she didn't like that and didn't believe that. And when we first met, uh, I was already in love, though I hadn't met her. And she was out in the backyard milking a cow. I thought, and I thought if she was barefooted and had on some cut off blue jeans, and her hair was all raggedy, but I thought she was the most beautiful girl in the world, and I wanted to take a picture of her, just like that's the first way I saw her. She misinterpreted that, and she stopped milking the cow, and she walked up to me and she said, if you don't get out of get out of my way. And if my mother didn't need this milk to make butter, I would throw it in your ugly face. Get out of my way.
Was that the best no you ever got? So, how did you turn that into a positive situation? You guys were married.
Well, I mean, I had already made up my mind on who she really was. She didn't know who I was, and she misread me completely. See, she thought I was making fun of her, and but I was very patient, and I never even thought of giving up.
That's important. How did you meet Dr. King?
I was invited to a religious emphasis week that a fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, was hosting on Talladega College campus. And they invited him from Montgomery. And I always say they thought he was so busy he might not come. So I was pastoring a little church in Thomasville, Georgia, and they invited me to come just in case he didn't show up. And we both showed up. And that's when the first time we realized that our wives knew each other and were from the same hometown, went to the same high school. But it took us, that was 1957. It took till 1961 before I began working with it.
And what happened, what lined up so that you two did work together? I mean, if it took a couple of years.
What was that?
What took between the couple of years where you met and you started working together, what happened? What prompted you? Did you decide to work with him? Did he call you? Was it a natural?
Well, it was
both in the same place.
It was too long to explain, but I was working in New York then, and had just bought a home, and just had two babies, and the third one was on the way. And the Nashville sit-in story came on, and I saw all of these young people, and who were really nonviolently making changes and were confronting racial segregation. And my wife felt the same way. And we were sitting there watching it on television, and she said, it's time for us to go home. And I said, we are home. We just bought this house. She said, yeah, this is the house we bought, but this isn't home. Our home is back south. And I said, well, what do you want to do? She said, sell this house. I said, well, where are we going to live? She said, somewhere back south. And so I quit my job, and I sold my house, and sold very quickly. And I had nowhere to go. And a number of sort of divine accidents happened. They closed down a school that I was looking at, she just wanted to be in the South and be a part of the civil rights movement. We weren't thinking of working with Martin Luther King, but the state of Tennessee closed the school down that I was thinking of working in. And I went to Atlanta on a grant from the United Church of Christ. And the office space that they arranged for me was right across the hall from Martin Luther King's office. And my wife had just had our third baby, so she was in Alabama with her mother, and I was in Atlanta by myself. And Dr. King's secretary said, since your wife's not here, why don't you help us out and help me answer Dr. King's mail? And she said, that'll keep you out of trouble. She said, idle mind is a devil's workshop. And she said, you get in trouble if you're here in Atlanta by yourself. And so she gave me a great big box of letters that people had written to him. And I started every night. I was staying at the YMCA. And every night I would write, 15, 20 letters and take them to her. She'd type them up and okay them. And that's how I got to know him, because I was trying to think like he would think to answer those letters. And I did, well, we had gone to the same kind of school and had similar backgrounds. He growing up in Atlanta and me growing up in New Orleans. And unlike most of the South, we probably had fairly privileged lives, because both of us came from families where our parents and grandparents had probably had, a good education and been to college.
Do you think, clearly you both worked together very closely through the civil rights movement, and you saw a lot of things. We don't even have time to get into all the stories that you have during that time, but do you think that it's time for a second civil rights movement, or did it ever really end?
Well, there's a Portuguese song, a saying, "A luta continua," which means the struggle continues. That we were struggling for the right to vote, for the right to eat at a lunch counter. Those have been taken care of pretty much. Now we're talking about the economic issues, the quality of education, the quality of healthcare. And there will always be a struggle. Even though we were in a human rights movement, the truth of it was nobody thought much about the rights of women. And then we're sort of perfecting our society. And there are new evils that emerge. If we conquer one problem, it only lets us know that there are two more or three more.
Right.
And so freedom is a constant struggle. Luta continua. The struggle continues.
Yes, it does continue for many people. Caitlin would like to know, what is the difference between a role model and a hero? And who's one of your heroes?
A role model is somebody that you admire and you think you can learn something from. You don't necessarily need to be like them or to be them. You have to be yourself, but you will learn that, like, I was successful because Martin Luther King was my role model in many ways, but I didn't want to be like him. I mean, I didn't want to be him. I didn't want his job. I wanted to work with him and help him. But that let me know that I didn't need to be like him because he already existed. He needed some alter somebody who would do things that he didn't like to do, but needed to be done. And so you define yourself according to the needs that exist around you. I was thinking that, well, at another commencement I spoke at, I remembered that, well, there was a medical school and they all had masks. And I said, you all are the class of the mask. And when I was growing up, the masked man was the Lone Ranger. And the Lone Ranger just fought evil all over the world. And I said, you're the first class that is coming out having to wear masks for graduation. But since it was a medical school, they were all going to be wearing masks when they got to the hospital, and probably the rest of their lives. And so I said, just like the Lone Ranger rode in on a white horse with his mask and fought evil wherever he found it, you will find evil in the world in which we live. And you can be the kind of Lone Ranger that will organize and get some help and wipe out whatever evil is that's in your path.
Yeah, we certainly need our young people today to lead the charge. They're doing so in so many ways. Brian would like to know about a difficult situation you've, I know, encountered many, but how do you get yourself through, motivate yourself to get yourself through difficult situations?
Well, I think I don't get myself through it. I think I pray about it. I meditate about it. I think about it. And I try to be sensitive to the other people around. And usually that leads me to somebody or to some pathway that will take me to the next step. But then at the next step, I'm going to find something else difficult that I have to work my way through. So it's, well, the New Testament says, seek and you shall find, knock and the door shall be opened. And I've found that to be true in life.
Can you, I think that's, I think that goes back to what we were saying earlier about just taking the path that's opening up in front of you. Can you talk about the story that you've told us about your time at when you were living at the Waldorf in New York?
Well, when I was ambassador to the United Nations, my residence was the 42nd floor of the Waldorf Astoria. And my favorite story about that is China had never been in the United Nations, and they came to the United Nations when I was ambassador. And nobody knew much about China then. We'd been closed off from China for 40 years. But the Chinese representatives knew a lot about us. But at a reception for the delegation, people couldn't think of anything to talk about but Chinese food. And it was embarrassing. And so my wife went off and sat by herself because she was kind of disgusted that we didn't know much about China, and started talking about Chinese food. Then the Chinese ambassador came over and sat next to her and said, where you find good Southern food? And she said, only at my house. When are you coming to dinner? So we brought the whole Chinese delegation over, and I said, good now, how are you going to find Southern food at Waldorf? She said, don't worry. My mother's driving up to Alabama, and she brought greens, uh, corn from her garden. She had a friend slow smoked some ribs. She went to the Waldorf, and they had about 25 stoves in their kitchen downstairs, and she picked two of them, and she said, "Now you all just let me have these stoves and stay out of my way." And she was about 75 or 78 years old, and she went down there in the Waldorf, and she fried chicken, she made cornbread, and I called a friend of mine in Atlanta and said, "What do you serve to drink at a good Southern dinner?" He said, "It'd be good to serve mint juleps." And so we had the Chinese delegation over. They loved the Southern food. They ate everything, and all the ribs and all of the fried chicken and all of the greens and cornbread and corn on the cob. And of course, drank a few mint juleps. So by the time we got through, normally in a formal dinner at the United Nations, after you eat, you toast each other's country, and then you go home. Well, they were feeling kind of good. All of them had gone to school in the United States, and they wanted to tell me about their experiences studying in the United States. So we went in the living room, and everybody just sat down on the floor, which is very undignified and undiplomatic. But it was people, we had become friends that quick. And so the whole time I was at the United Nations, I never had any problem getting the Chinese delegation to go along with us. And they never vetoed a single issue. And I had the same relationship with the Russians. And everybody supposed to be our enemy and our friends, but we treated everybody like friends, like part of the family. And they really appreciated that. And it wasn't the way it was usually done, but it worked, and it worked very well.
I think it worked because you were being authentic and just being kind. You know,
Well, actually, come to think of it, I forgot. Your father was a very good friend of the Indian ambassador, and the Indian ambassador was one of the elder statesmen at the United Nations who was old enough to have known Mahatma Gandhi personally. And he wanted to meet me, and your father came up and took us to lunch. And I learned so much about life from Gandhi's work in India. That was our motto for our social change in the South. And so he and I became like father and son. And he had been at the UN from the beginning, from the earliest days. And he knew how the place worked, and he knew everybody. And he said, "If you don't mind my giving you some advice every now and then," he said, "I know India is not supposed to advise the United States of America, but there's some things that," I said, "No, this will just be between us. Anything you can say or do to help me be a better ambassador for the United States of America, I would appreciate your help." And he would call me and he would say, "I just saw this resolution, and it's a very good resolution. I agree with it, but you have one line that says so and so and so and so, and that's going to offend the Germans, maybe, or that will, England would rather you phrase it this way." And he advised me on little sensitivities that nobody at the State Department would be particularly aware of. But because he had been there since the beginning, uh, he knew the details of the United Nations that I needed, and that turned out to help me do a much better job than I would have on my own.
Yeah, so
So looking and listening to other people help you, and people are anxious to help you and give you advice.
and sometimes that advice comes from unexpected places, but it's still, that can actually be better because it's a very different perspective than what you're probably getting. So it's really important. Could you talk about the role, like if students are going into private business, how can
What's that?
they make an impact on their community? I know that, you know, there's a very famous story, and you talk about it a lot, of Dr. King, and after he won the Nobel Prize, how the private community really pulled together to create impact in the city. Could you tell that story and then share with us how
I'm not sure what story that is.
when Dr. King got his Nobel Prize and there was a dinner being hosted? Yeah. Could you tell that story, please?
Yeah, there were some people, this was 1964, and so there were some people that were still not comfortable with, well, the hotels still weren't completely integrated, or they were just beginning to be integrated. And so there were some people that wondered whether or not they would support this. And I think it was the president of Coca-Cola and the mayor, Ivan Allen, both of whom were white, but who called the business community together and said, look, we're an international company, and we thought this was an international city, but you got to decide whether you're going to be a southern country town with backwater views on race and creed and class, or are you going to become part of the future? And that a city that refuses to honor one of its sons who has just won the Nobel Peace Prize is the kind of city that said, we can't, as an international company, we can't afford to be in a city that has that kind of reputation. So it turned out that everybody then realized that it was an honor to have a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And just because he happened to be black um, didn't mean that he did not deserve the honor. We've had two Nobel Peace Prize winners from Georgia. First, Martin Luther King, but second, President Jimmy Carter, who I think was one of the most, well, he was the only president, I think, in the history of the United States where there was nobody killed by any American soldier anywhere in the world while he was president, and no American soldier got killed. And yet everything changed. He changed the Southern Africa. He welcomed China into the United Nations. We had an arms limitation treaty with the Russians. He got Israel and Egypt together. We had a Panama Canal treaty. And he did so much so fast that nobody gave him any credit for it because it looked so easy. These were things that had been impossible for people for a long, well, there had not been a reasonable approach to Panama for 400 years.
Do you think he needed to be a better self-promoter? Is that something that...
No, I think the thing that made him powerful and made him a great president was that he was not a self-promoter, that he promoted the United States of America, and he promoted those values that we wanted to share with the rest of the world. And he even, when it came time to deal with the question of inflation, he could have appointed someone to the Federal Reserve that would have taken it very slow and on inflation, and he could have possibly gotten elected. But he didn't do that. He appointed the person that would get rid of inflation the quickest, even though he knew that that meant running interest rates up to 18, 19% for a little while in order to get the economy straight. But if he got the economy straight, he would not get reelected. And he said, my concern is not whether I get reelected. My concern is what is right for the country. And if it's right for the country to bring down inflation and save everybody's economy, it doesn't matter what happens to me. And I think we were so unused to seeing people like that, that we didn't realize how great a man and president he had been.
I think we're still not very used to seeing people like that. And you're certainly one of those people that live life like that. I think that also goes back to the ego thing that we were talking about before, where you do things for the right reasons to get things done, not because it has something to do with you, right? Not because you're going to benefit from it. And I think he's a perfect embodiment of that. Okay, so one more question from student. Kevin would like to know what the best piece of advice is that you ever received.
I would say when I was 4 years old, my father, it's funny. I was born in New Orleans, and the headquarters of the Nazi Party was 50 yards from where I was born. And my father took me in walking by there. My aunt lived 2 doors behind the Nazi Party, and you could sit on her porch, and there was no air conditioning in those days, so the windows were open, and we would be looking in on the meetings of the Nazi Party when they'd be hiling Hitler. And my father told me that these are white supremacists. And he said, that God made of one blood all the nations of the earth. And they don't understand that, but you don't get mad with them. In fact, if you get mad, the blood rushes from your head and you do something stupid. He said, don't get mad, get smart. When something confronts you that's a problem and that you disagree with, stay calm, use your mind. And if you lose your temper in a fight and get angry, you surely lose the fight. So don't get mad, get smart. And I think that's the best advice I was given. And I was given that at 4 years old. I saw my son give his son some advice, and he was just about 5 or 6, but he hit his sister. And my son grabbed him and pulled him away. He said, look, never strike a woman. And his mother said, but she hit him first. He said, yes, but she can hit him. But no man in this family ever strikes a woman. And if you start fighting your sister, well, your brother never put his hand on you, I'm sure.
Never. He would have gotten something coming to him. But no, Bo and Angelica are great parents. One last question, and then we'll wrap things up today. Arthi would like to know how you control your ego when you're thinking of the larger ecosystem.
Well, I think that when you have a big ego, it's a sign of your insecurity. And there's a thing that Dr. King had on his desk, a sign that said, there's no limit to what you can do if you don't mind who gets the credit. And I think that he got more than his share credit, but he was always very generous and insisting that we give the NAACP credit, that the students deserve the credit for this, that we were just helping out. And I think that was the reason why he was able to get along with everybody and why everybody was supporting him, because he tried to support everybody else. And I do too.
Well, Ambassador Young, I really want to thank you for joining us today. We have so many more questions, but I know that you only have so much time. So thank you so much.
It's been good for me.
Well,
so thank you very much. And remember, commencement is the beginning of your life. And if you write down a few things that you're afraid of, that you're concerned about, that you think are going to be problems for you, write them down and put them away somewhere. And then in a couple of years, come back and look, and I guarantee you will have solved all of them. If not, you're on the way to solving the rest of them.
That's right. Yep. Little time capsule for yourself.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Young. I want to remind all of our students and everyone watching that we do this every week, and we have incredible guests coming up that are going to help guide you on your futures. So make sure you search for us on the web at SuperNova Commencements. You can search me, you can search SuperNova South. And graduates, please let us know what you're up to. Leave us a comment. We'd love to celebrate your successes. And just remember that it's a blessing to be a blessing. And best of luck to you on your journeys. Thanks so much. See you guys soon.
You.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay.
Bye.